But first up, let's talk about the basics of aggregate functions, what's available to us, and some of the different rules that are in place when we're using aggregate functions. Aggregates are used to perform calculations on data, and typically it's going to be, well, forgive me, some form of an aggregation. So we're going to be looking for an average or a count or a maximum or a minimum or things like that. Things where we're going to be taking an awful lot of data, putting all of that together in some form of an aggregation. So for example, I might be looking for the average sales per region, maybe broken down based on region. Maybe I'm looking for the highest priced product inside of each category, or I'm looking for the best performing salesperson, maybe per department or per sales territory or something like that. And those are the types of queries that I'm going to be able to execute because of aggregates. Now, aggregates have a couple of very basic rules that we need to be aware of. First of all is that null values are ignored, and this can potentially cause some problems. So for example, if I perform a sum, what's going to happen is it's going to add up every single row that has a value. If there's anything in there that would have a null, it's simply going to be skipped. So I might not truly be getting my answer that I'm expecting. The exact same thing will hold true if I decided to do an average. That if I do an average, it's going to add up all the different non-null values and then divide that by the total number of non-null values. So for example, if I had, let's say, 10 rows, of which 3 of them were null, what would wind up happening is these 7 values that actually existed would be added up, and we would divide by 7 rather than dividing by 10. So my null values are going to be ignored. You do want to keep that in mind. When you put aggregate values on a select line, every single column must be inside of an aggregate, or they have to be inside of a group by. And the basic concept here is kind of twofold. Number one, if I've got a non-aggregate along with other aggregates, well, what are we telling SQL to do exactly? Additionally, an aggregate sort of by design without a group by is going to give me one value. There can only be one sum, for example, or only one max or only one min. So if I'm doing a select where I've got a column that's not inside of an aggregate, where I'm now going to get back every single row for that column, and I've got an aggregate which is only going to give me back one row, that poses a little bit of a problem for SQL. It doesn't know how to handle this. So the requirement is that either A, every single column must be inside of an aggregate, or B, it must be listed inside of a group by. SQL 2012 contains several built-in aggregate functions that you can use, and we're going to be taking a look at a couple of them in here. It is possible to create brand new ones. However, there's a little bit of logic and code that needs to go into creating an aggregate function. It's not just as simple as doing, say, a select statement or just simply doing a real simple bit of addition or subtraction. So as a result, if you are going to create your own aggregate function, they have to be created with .NET code and uploaded into SQL Server inside of what's known as a .NET assembly, which is really just a generic term to say that we have to upload a DLL into SQL Server. As I mentioned, SQL 2012 contains many aggregate functions. I've listed a few of them here, although you'll notice that if you check out the documentation or what's frequently known as books online, you'll be able to find all the other aggregate functions that are built in. I've listed some of the most common ones here. For starters, you'll notice that we've got sum, which of course is just going to add up every single value. We've got count, and what count will do is it will give me the total number for either A, fields that contain a non-null value, if you specified a particular column name, or B, if you put in an asterisk, it will count every single row. Now, one thing that some people will do is if they're wanting to count every single row, they'll say count 1, or they'll say count and then pass in whatever column is being used for the primary key, because of course there's guaranteed to be a value for every single primary key. I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. SQL doesn't care. if you do a count star, if you do a count and then pass in the number 1, if you do a count and you pass in whatever column is the primary key, SQL's going to do the exact same thing. So if what you're looking for is every single row in the table, you want to know the total number, just go ahead and do a count star. That's all you really need to do. If you're looking for the number of non-null values, however, inside of a particular column, then you'll want to do a count and then whatever column it is that you're looking for. Finally, you'll notice that we have max, we have min, and we have AVG, which will give us the maximum value, the minimum value, and of course the average value respectively. Let's take a real quick look at utilizing count. Just bring up my Management Studio here, and let's connect to AdventureWorks. And what I want to do is I want to find every single contact, and then I want to find every single contact that has an entry for middle name. We can actually do this, of course, inside of one query, and we're going to use count for this. So let's start off by saying select and then count. And as I mentioned before, if we want to find every single row, I could go ahead and say contact ID, which is the primary key inside the contact table. I could say count star, which is what I'm going to use, or I could just simply say count 1. And you'll see a lot of people do that. Honestly, that's an urban legend. There is no difference between doing a count star and a count 1. They'll both do the exact same thing. So I'm going to say count star, and let's go ahead and alias this, and we'll say total contacts. And then let's go ahead and say count, and then we'll say middle name, and then we'll say as contacts with middle name. And then we'll say from person contact. And now you'll notice that we've got 19,972 total contacts and then 11,473 that have a middle name. Of course, when you're using aggregates, we typically want to be able to group things together that just simply seeing the average or the minimum or the maximum or the total number of rows really isn't what I'm looking for when I'm looking for aggregates. Works is a very simple demo to start, but it's not very much real world. Let's turn our attention to a couple of more real world queries, but if we're going to get into that, we need to talk about using group by statements.